Hi, everyone. I hope this will be a short video, but yeah, you never know. I wanted to pop on and talk a little bit about some of the books that I'm reading in January. I do want to make this really quick so that I can get back to reading books. But I wanted to mention first and foremost that I'm reading The Crown by Nancy Bilyeu. This is a book that was published in 2012. I think they've been reprinted recently. I don't know if exactly the story. But these are, I think, new covers from the original, and this one has her on the Oprah magazine, list. So it's gotten Oprah's endorsement. I picked up this book because some of you may know that my second novel involves espionage, and it also involves there is going to be an intriguing convent. So, a convent on the continent that hides royalists. That's going to be one of the things that I pick up at some point. That's going to be one of the places that I explore. And I was just curious to see, like, nuns and spies. Like, what might I find if I did a little research on that? And this book came up. So, yeah, it's not like the nun is kind of wandering off and traveling everywhere to spy, at least at this point. But it is an interesting book. It's set during the reign of Henry VIII, right around the time that the monasteries, religious houses are being closed down. The main character, Joanna Stafford, is a nun, and she has snuck out of the convent in order to go essentially be present when her cousin, who is a traitor to the crown and a Catholic, is executed, and she ends up finding herself in the tower, and then being strong armed by Bishop Winchester into going back to her monastery and attempting to find a relic, which is quite mysterious. Actually, I'll be curious to know what we learn about this thing, and I mean, she's being kind of held hostage in a sense because her father, who's also a traitor, is in jail, and so this is his get out of jail card, her being able to fulfill this quest. And along the way, she there are other murders that happen at the convent. So anyway, it's interesting. If people like CJ Sampson's Shard Lake series, they might find this interesting. I know that the very first book in that series is Dissolution. So I think the very first book is set in a monastery, and it is about about the closing of the monasteries, or at least that's the kind of the context or what they're moving towards in the story. Anyway, I'm really enjoying it. It's very fast paced. I I find that I'm interested in the characters. It definitely has a little bit more of the sort of mystery sort of approach and tone than a lot of the things I've been reading lately. But it's nice to like read a book and then not want to put it down. I definitely stayed up way too late last week when I should have been prepping for my classes because I was, reading past, 11, which for me is late. The other book that I'm reading right now is An Eye for an Eye by Anthony Trollope, and that's part of my big buddy reads that I do with Joe Smith. This is a shorter novel, and by shorter I mean it's not 80 chapters, which is pretty common with Trollope's, a lot of the big books. It is kind of a strange novel. It by chapter one, it's falling into a familiar pattern of Trollope. There's an aristocrat. He's married. His wife dies. His son is corrupt and a drunkard and marries a prostitute, and then he dies. And so the old man, who's since remarried to a slightly younger woman, now has to worry about an heir. And so he turns to his nephews, from whom he's estranged because he didn't agree with their father marrying their mother. And a lot of the novel really is about this anxiety about, passing on the property and also making sure that that the heir makes an appropriate marriage. And naturally, he's in the army or the military, and he's fallen in love with an Irish girl. I think in a lot of ways it seems to be covering a lot of the territory that Trollope really likes to cover. There is some humor in the narration, but the weird thing about the novel is it begins with this story of a character who's unnamed, who's in a mental asylum, and the only thing we really know about this character at the end of that little sort of prologue is the fact that Lord Scroop, so the main aristocratic character in the novel, or perhaps the future Lord Scroop, is paying for her quarterly board. So it is a little bit sinister. So everything else that we're reading, we're kind of trying to figure out, which one of these female characters is going to end up in an asylum. Anyway, it's definitely been an interesting read so far. I mean, it's certainly not one of Trollope's best, but Joe and I are hell-bent on reading them all. And I do think I will have to go back and read a few of my favorites after we're done with this project as sort of a maybe a bit of a palate cleanser. Um, so those are the books I'm currently reading, and probably will finish those fairly quickly. I think probably I'll have The Crown finished by the weekend. And then the next book on the dock is yet another historical novel. This is Jesmyn Ward's Let Us Descend, which was just published in 2023, a few months back. I had my eye on it for a while, and I almost did a pre-order, but I waited, and I ended up buying it right before Christmas. I thought I was going to read it during break, but that didn't happen. I was reading a bunch of other stuff. And so I am planning this to be my next book, so I'll be picking this up sometime next week. I've been waiting for this book for a really long time. Some of you know that I'm a huge fan of Ward, that her novel, Sing Unburied Sing, is one that I teach regularly in my Intro to Literary Studies class. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to teach that class for a few years, but I'm really excited now to come and finally read this novel, which I first heard her talk about, again, several years back. I was at the National Undergraduate Literature Conference, which is held here in Utah, up at Weber State University in Ogden. And that's a conference for students. Creative writing, literature will come and present their work from all over the country. And they always have some really high-profile writers and artists that come and participate in that conference. And the last year that I went, Jesmyn Ward was there, and she was brilliant, and she was gracious, and she talked about this new novel that she was writing that was going to be set in New Orleans during slavery. And here it finally is. So I am very excited to read it, and I kind of wish I'd read it a few weeks ago, but I think it'll be a nice change of pace after reading a bunch of historical novels, which I've been sort of reading towards the end of the year. There were a few other things I read, one of which I'll talk about right now, and that is an indie author. A couple years ago, again, I just want to say that COVID is confusing. I can't put a date on anything anymore. But it was during COVID, at some point, I attended for the first time the Historical Novel Society's North America Conference. They just did one this past summer in San Antonio. And the one I went to was supposed to be in San Antonio, but they ended up doing it online because of COVID. And so one of the virtues of that, not that I'm a shy person, but I was in some settings where I was sort of forced to introduce myself to a large number of people. So one of the things that happened were thematic discussion rooms. So they might have one on literature set in Scotland, which I attended, but they also had one on the English Civil War. And that is, I think, probably one of the first ones I went to. And even though I wasn't writing a novel about the English Civil War, that's the novel that will involve the spy and then spying nuns, at the time, I knew I was going to, and so I definitely wanted to get in there and find out what people were doing. And we went around. The person who was the host made us all introduce ourselves and talk about what we were doing. So I didn't have very much to say except that it was a future project. But one of the people that was introduced, that was present in that room, was a woman named Carissa Bazos. This is her second novel, but at the time, I was really kind of excited to hear about her work. Again, so many of these people were just lovely, gracious, but she was an indie writer, and I didn't really know any indie writers. Coming out of academia, there's so much emphasis on the gatekeepers and just accepting that that's sort of the way that it is. And one of the things I learned at this conference is that there are a lot of people whose books have found their way to agents, and then the agents just could not get the big five or even slightly smaller organizations to take an interest. And my experience at the conference, I met with someone who was kind of my de facto mentor for the conference, and she immediately said to me, which was maybe a little rude, maybe it was a bit of a wake-up call, but she was just like, oh yeah, she's like, I don't think you're going to find an agent for that historical period. It's not popular enough, And so I'm not sure really why any one writer takes the path that they did, but this particular writer made the decision to self-publish and work with a company that basically does all the groundwork for you, which is really great. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go cheap. But anyway, I, at the time, was very impressed with her. I thought she was really interesting. I was meeting other writers who were indie writers and giving advice and talking about, really how indie writers are becoming more respected, more prominent. And I remember thinking, like, okay, I know I don't want to take this path, but I should certainly investigate it in case I do make that choice down the line. So I picked up her book, Traitor's Knot, which is set uh, towards the after the execution of the king mostly, but involves two characters who are both royalists that sort of come together. And there is a romantic element to the story, but mostly it really is kind of, looking at the royalists, or people kind of in hiding under oppression, the oppression of, the rule of Cromwell and his followers. And so I really liked the book. I thought it was really well written. I kind of forgot that I think it was supposed to be a romance. I mean, it wasn't that it was not a romance, but it wasn't sort of what I thought a romance would be. So it wasn't until we hit like a really steamy 3-page sex scene where I was like, oh, right, it's a romance. Like I knew these characters were coming together, but the storylines were interesting. The characters individually were really interesting. And I was like, I really like this book. Now, I read a lot of first novels or first books and series, especially with historical fiction. There aren't really that many that I have any interest in continuing, but I really wanted to continue with this series. And when I made that decision, I decided that I was just going to buy her second book, The Severed Knot, as a paperback. And I want to talk about that in a minute. But what I was also interested in, and one of the reasons why I decided to read book 2, is the fact that she takes a character that's introduced quite late during an attempt a fight between the Scottish and the English in an attempt to get Charles on the throne. She takes that character and he ends up going to Barbados as an indentured servant and finds himself on a sugar plantation. And then the female character that's introduced is from Ireland. I don't quite know the story of how she gets there, but I thought, wow, I really like this. I was a real fan of I can't even think of her name, but the Irish writer. Terrible. Oh my God, my brain. Anyway, the woman who there's a woman who the Dublin Murder Squad. That author. I'll probably figure it out and put it down below. But I really like that, where you're introduced to a range of characters and then you see one and you get to see their story. I like that kind of approach to a 3-part book or to a 3-book series. And so I decided that I would go ahead and pick it up. But because I have made the decision that I'm going to self-publish my novel, I just wanted to see what a book looked like when you purchased it directly from Amazon. So I assume that this was, KDP, this was like basically, print on demand. And although it's a little bigger than I thought maybe it would be, like, I kind of feel like I'd like a smaller paperback. I realize this is a small hardbound. It's just a little bit shorter. But again, I just wanted to see what the quality was. And other than the fact that it seems big to me, that I would probably want to go a little smaller, the production, it looks great. So I'm looking forward to reading it. What was I going to say about, about just independent authors is that, I will make a video a little later, probably not for another week or two, about why in the end I made the decision to not requery agents and to take this path. But I do feel like there's a lot of really interesting literature out there that is being produced independently. And I'm going to share a story that Jo Smith told me when she went home to visit her family in the UK over the holidays. She mentioned to me that like half the books that her mom had out, I think from the library, maybe, were indie books, things that she'd never heard of. So, apparently they're finding their way to libraries. People are buying them. Again, I have asked before if you ever read indie books, but yeah, this is really, I've only read a handful of independently published novels over the past year. And a couple of the novels I read over the last year were novels from small publishing houses that are legitimate, but will allow people to submit directly. So Duckworth Press, I want to say Pegasus maybe is one of them, Pegasus Books. There's one or two others where I went out of my way to purchase books from them just to see, well, what are they? What's the expectation? What's the quality of the product? And, I realized that, maybe just looking at trying to figure out what's being published and getting on bestseller lists, which is not really my concern. I mean, I would like readers, but I'm not looking to make a living. really. I mean, I really can't imagine myself publishing more than one book a year once I get back into the groove. But anyway, so that's that. That's what I'm going to be reading this month. So that'll be four novels plus Trader's Knot, which was the one that I finished up in the new year, started it during December of 2023. I am also interested, though, in having anyone recommend something more contemporary for me. So, and I'm kind of in the mood for something a little different. So if you've read sci-fi, horror, maybe fantasy, me, no YA, please. I'm just not going to go there ever, probably again. But if there's something that you've read, and not something that's not especially long either, I don't like to read. If I read the first in a series and I really love it, then I'm going to end up reading the rest of them. So I'd love a standalone, but that's not an absolute requirement. If you have something that you want to suggest to me, that would be great. I would love to hear from you. Anyway, I hope everyone is having a good new year so far. Here we are on day 11. I'm feeling very optimistic in general, even though like it snowed buckets last night and we ended up having a delayed start at school today. It was crazy. And my poor mom went to the doctor's office, and then when she came home, she ended up in a snowbank. But fortunately, people hopped out of their cars and got her moving again, so that was good. But anyway, I hope everyone's doing well, and I will be tuning in next week with something for you. We shall see. Bye.